Death row isn't meant to have survivors, but sometimes the machinery stutters, the current cuts short, the rope slips, and in that brief hesitation between life and death, something breaks loose. Every time it leaves behind a question no court can answer. If even death can fail, what does justice really mean? And in Ohio, they spent 2 hours trying to end one man's life, and he walked back to his cell, still breathing. Romell Broom, Ohio. On September 15, 2009, inside the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, a man named Romell Broom came as close as anyone ever has to escaping death itself. He had waited 25 years for that moment, convicted in 1984 for the abduction, rape, and murder of a girl named Trina Middleton. She was walking home from a football game in Cleveland when Broom forced her into his car. She tried to escape. She ran, fought, screamed, but she didn't make it home. Her body was found the next morning. The evidence was clear. The verdict was death. For decades, Broom sat in a cell no wider than his outstretched arms, counting time in legal motions and appeals. Every denial brought him closer to the chair, or in Ohio's case, the needle. By the morning of his execution, Broom was calm. He'd eaten a heavy breakfast, called his family, and spoken quietly with the prison chaplain. He had accepted what was coming. At 1:31 p.m., guards escorted him into the chamber. The air was thick with disinfectant and tension. Witnesses filed in behind the glass. The curtains opened. The team began searching for a vein. His arms were scarred from years of injections, years of prison blood draws. They tried the left arm, then the right, his hand, his foot, his ankle. Every time, the vein rolled or collapsed. Every time, the needle slid in and came out again, leaving only blood and confusion. Minutes passed, then an hour, then 2. He grimaced, winced, even tried to help them find a spot himself. At one point, he covered his eyes and whispered, "Can't you just find it?" The witnesses could hear the muffled voices through the glass, the hum of the machines, the shuffle of nervous feet. One technician muttered something about bad veins. Another wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. By 2:40 p.m., after more than 2 hours of failed attempts and nearly 30 punctures, the warden made a decision no one in that room was prepared for. Stop. The execution was called off. Romell Broom was led, still bleeding from his arms, back to his cell, alive. No cheers, no relief, just confusion and the sound of heavy doors closing behind him. Outside, the story hit the airwaves like a spark in a dry field. Ohio man survives execution attempt. Reporters camped outside the prison. Lawmakers argued. And in the middle of it all sat Broom, a man condemned to die, but not dead. He later wrote about that day from his cell. He described the fear, the pain, the humiliation. He said, "They killed me that day, that they just didn't finish the job." The state tried to set a new date, to fix the procedure and do it right the second time. His lawyers fought back, arguing that another attempt would be unconstitutional, cruel, unusual, and barbaric. The case dragged on for years. Courts debated whether one failed execution meant he had, in a way, already paid the ultimate price. No decision ever came. Before the state could try again, nature did what bureaucracy couldn't. Romell Broom died in 2020, not from the needle, but from cancer, alone in his cell. He was 64, 36 years after his crime. 11 years after the day death came for him and missed. And still, his story hangs in the air like a warning, that even when justice has a schedule, death doesn't always keep it. Because before the needle ever failed in Ohio, in Louisiana, a teenager walked into the electric chair and came out alive. Willie Francis, Louisiana, 1946. A small town called St. Martinville, hot air, dirt roads, and a justice system that never bothered to whisper. In 1944, a pharmacist named Andrew Thomas was found dead behind his drugstore. 2 gunshots, one to the chest, one to the neck. The town was quiet for a moment, and then it wasn't. A white man had been murdered, and before the body was even buried, they'd already found their suspect, a black teenager named Willie Francis. He was 16, thin, soft-spoken, worked odd jobs, mowing lawns, sweeping floors, running errands for the same man now lying in a pool of blood. He had no lawyer, no witnesses to speak for him, and no chance. The police dragged him from his home in Port Arthur, Texas. They said he confessed, but they didn't mention the beatings, the threats, or the gun pressed to his ribs. In that time, in that town, a confession was whatever they wrote down. Within days, he was charged with murder. Within weeks, sentenced to die. The method? Electrocution. A new machine for a new kind of justice. They called it gruesome Gertie. A pine chair bolted together by hand, traveling from parish to parish in the back of a pickup truck. When it arrived in St. Martinville, people came to see it, some out of curiosity, others to make sure it worked. On May 3rd, 1946, Willie Francis was led into the small red brick jailhouse that held the chair. He was 17 now, thin as wire, his head shaven, his hands shaking. The men who brought the chair were both drunk. They had reassembled it wrong, crossing wires, misplacing screws, but no one checked, no one cared. The priest whispered a prayer. Willie tried to speak. Then they placed the hood over his head and threw the switch. The lights dimmed. The room filled with a low hum and the smell of burning fabric. He screamed. He twisted. He called out, "Take it off! Take it off!" The current cut out. Silence. Then confusion. Willie Francis was still alive, breathing, trembling, eyes wide beneath the hood. The generator had failed. The current had missed its mark, and for the first time anyone could remember, the electric chair had spared a man. They carried him back to his cell, half conscious, burned, but alive. Outside, the story exploded. Boy survives electric chair. The headlines made him a ghost the law couldn't bury. His lawyers argued that another attempt would be torture, cruel, unusual, and forbidden by the Constitution. The case climbed all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. 5 judges said it wasn't cruelty, just a malfunction. 4 called it inhuman, the majority won. A year later, the chair came back to St. Martinville. They fixed the wires, checked the current, tightened every bolt. On May 9th, 1947, Willie Francis was strapped down again. This time, when the switch was thrown, the lights stayed dim. The current held. The room stayed silent. He was 18, executed by the same machine that had already failed him once. And long after the lights flickered back on, one question lingered. If justice needs 2 tries to take a life, was it ever justice at all? Because decades later, halfway across the world, another man's body would hang limp from a rope, and then, impossibly, start breathing again. Aliraza M, Iran, 2013. A cold morning in Botched prison, grey walls, grey sky, and the quiet ritual of death by hanging. Aliraza M had been condemned for drug possession, a crime that, under Iranian law, often ended at the gallows. Not for murder, not for violence, just narcotics. But in that place at that time, the line between crime and death was a thin one. The morning of his execution began like all the others. Prison guards moving in silence, the cleric reading the final prayers. The condemned, blindfolded, hands bound, led up the wooden steps. No one speaks much at a hanging. There's only the creak of the rope, the shuffle of boots, the heartbeat of inevitability. At dawn, the trapdoor opened, the body dropped, and the world carried on. The witnesses signed the papers, the officials nodded, and Aliraza's body was lowered into a black plastic bag. The family was told to prepare for burial. The morgue received him. He was placed on a steel table, the zipper pulled shut. Hours later, a morgue worker walked past and froze. Something was moving inside the bag. He heard a sound, faint, rhythmic, breathing. He unzipped it, and the man who was supposed to be dead opened his eyes. The rope had failed to break his neck. He'd hung for minutes, long enough to lose consciousness, but not life. The body that the state declared finished had never truly let go. Panic spread through the morgue. Doctors rushed in. They worked to stabilize him, their hands trembling between duty and disbelief. When the news reached the prison, no one knew what to do. The law had no script for resurrection. Religious scholars debated. Some said he must hang again, that justice hadn't been done. Others called his survival divine will, a sign that God himself had overruled the sentence. The public took sides. One half saw a miracle. The other saw a loophole that made the law look mortal. For weeks, the case lingered in silence. And then, quietly, the government made its decision. Aliraza M would not face the rope again. His punishment, they said, had already been carried out. He walked out of that morgue alive, a man who had seen his own death and come back from it. And though the world would forget his name, the moment itself would stay whispered in the halls of power, a reminder that even when death is written into law, sometimes the body refuses to sign. Because while Aliraza M gasped back to life on a cold slab in Iran, thousands of miles away, another condemned man would face the same promise of death and watch the state fail him in almost the exact same way. Alva Campbell, Ohio, November 15th, 2017. A grey morning, the kind that feels like it's already given up. In the death chamber at Lucasville, an old man lay on the gurney, trembling beneath a white sheet. His name was Alva Campbell, and he was dying long before the state tried to help him along. He'd lived 70 years, most of them behind bars or running from them. A man whose life had been a slow collapse, from petty theft to robbery, from violence to murder. But the crime that brought him here happened 2 decades earlier. It began in 1997 with a lie. Campbell faked paralysis to trick a court deputy into helping him stand. When the cuffs came off, he attacked, stole the deputy's gun, escaped the courthouse and hijacked a car. The driver was Charles Diles, a 30-something man on his way to work. He pleaded for his life. Campbell shot him twice in the head and left him slumped behind the wheel on the side of the highway. The trial was fast. The verdict was certain. Death by lethal injection. For 20 years, the sentence waited. By the time the date arrived, Campbell was a wreck of a man, riddled with cancer, emphysema, a colostomy bag strapped to his body. He could barely breathe without an oxygen tube, but Ohio had a schedule, and mercy wasn't part of it. At 10 a.m., they brought him into the same room where Romell Broom once lay. The air smelled of antiseptic and ghosts. The technicians began to search for a vein. Left arm, right arm, leg, foot, nothing held. Every puncture collapsed, leaving a dot of blood and frustration. The room fell silent except for the sound of latex snapping and Campbell's uneven breathing. Minutes turned into an hour. A nurse whispered something about his condition. One of the team looked at the warden, and once again, Ohio met its limit. Stop! The execution was called off. They wheeled him out, pale, shaking, alive. Outside, reporters recognized the pattern. Another failed execution, another headline about a system that couldn't even finish what it started. For the next year, Campbell wasted away in a prison hospital. The cancer spread, his lungs failed. The same veins they couldn't pierce began to close on their own. And before the state could schedule another date, nature stepped in. He died in 2018, not by the needle, but by the same slow decay the courts had tried to hurry. For Ohio, it was déjà vu. 2 men, 2 failures. Same chamber, same state, same ghost of a system that still called itself justice. And while the sterile light of the execution room flickered and faded, half a world away, in the heat and dust of revolution, a man would face an entire firing squad, and somehow live to tell it. Wenceslao Moguel, Mexico, 1915. A nation tearing itself apart. The revolution had turned every street into a battlefield, every sunrise into a gamble. And in the middle of that chaos stood Wenceslao Moguel, a young soldier caught on the wrong side of history. The year was 1915. Moguel had been accused of fighting against the revolutionary forces of Venustiano Carranza. To them, that was enough. In a war built on executions, there were no trials, just orders. He was dragged from his cell before dawn, hands bound, shirt torn, the sound of boots on gravel echoing through the courtyard where the condemned waited for the sun to rise. There was no ceremony, no priest, just rifles, 8 of them. The men who carried them didn't look at him, they didn't have to. At the command, they raised their guns. The shots rang out like thunder. The bullets tore through his chest, his arms, his stomach. He fell, The air went still. Then came the final step, the coup de grace, a shot to the head. One of the soldiers stepped forward, pressed the barrel against his cheek, and pulled the trigger. The body jerked once, then went limp. They left him there among the dust and blood. By sunrise, the firing squad had moved on to their next task. Wenceslao Moguel was presumed dead, but he wasn't. Hours later, he woke, half buried beneath the bodies of the other condemned, one eye blind, face shattered by the bullet meant to finish him, and yet somehow he could still move. He crawled toward the sound of birds, each drag of his body pulling him further from the line where he was supposed to end. No one knows how far he crawled before someone found him, but they did. And against every rule of logic and war, he survived. The bullet that entered his face never left. He carried it for the rest of his life. Proof of a miracle or a mistake too big for death to correct. Years later, photographers would capture him. One eye gone, scar running across his cheek like a map of defiance. He became a symbol of something Mexico never quite forgot, that even when death fires point blank, sometimes it still misses. And while Moguel's body healed under the sun, across another border, in another time, a woman would face a punishment meant to erase her, stone by stone, until mercy interrupted the crowd. Zoleykhah Kadkhoda, Iran, 1997, a village near the border with Pakistan. Hot wind, dirt streets, and the weight of old laws still heavier than stone. Her name was Zoleykhah Kadkhoda. She was 25, a seamstress, a widow. In her world, a woman without a husband lived in the shadows, half seen, half safe. The charge was adultery, a word that carried more power than proof. Rumors whispered through the village like dust in a storm. Someone said they'd seen her with a man who wasn't her husband. Someone else swore they'd heard them. That was enough. Under Iran's penal code at the time, adultery could mean death by stoning. No jury, no mercy, only witnesses, stones, and scripture twisted into punishment. They took her to an open lot on the edge of town. The crowd gathered, men with shovels, women clutching their children's hands. A pit was dug in the sand, waist deep. Zoleykhah was lowered into it, her body bound, her face veiled. The sentence was read aloud. Then the stones began. The first few missed, the next ones didn't. Each strike thudded against skin, bone, breath. The air filled with the sound of death, delivered by neighbors. She fell silent. Her body slumped. Someone shouted that she was dead. The crowd hesitated, just long enough for one man to notice her chest still moving. He dropped his stone. Then another followed, and another. Soon the crowd stopped. What began as a sentence turned into confusion, shame mixing with fear. When officials arrived to collect the body, they found her alive. Barely. The government tried to hide it. They said the sentence would be reconsidered. And quietly, in the weeks that followed, it was lifted. Zoleykhah Kadkhoda survived. Her body healed. Her name, whispered across the country, became something the authorities didn't like to hear. A reminder that even obedience could falter when faced with the sight of a breathing woman in a pit. She vanished from the public eye. Some say she changed her name. Some say she left the country. But her story lingered, heavy as the stones that failed to silence her. Because not every executioner wears a uniform, and not every sentence needs a rope or a gun to leave its mark. And while the crowd in Iran dropped their stones in disbelief, centuries earlier in England, a man dangled from the gallows, cut down too soon, and woke to the sound of his own heartbeat. John Halfhang Smith, England, 1705, London. Winter wind slicing down the narrow streets of Tyburn Hill. Crowds gathering like it's theatre, because in 1705, executions were. The condemned man was John Smith, a thief, pickpocket, and housebreaker. 31 years old, thin, ragged, not remarkable. Except for how long he refused to die. Smith had made a living from other people's property. Silver spoons, candlesticks, pocket watches, whatever he could take before the owner noticed. He'd been caught before, jailed, flogged, released. But this time, the sentence was final, hanged by the neck until dead. The morning of his execution, the city turned out. Children sat on rooftops. Vendors sold bread and ale to the spectators. The air smelled of smoke, mud, and anticipation. Smith stood beneath the gallows, his hands bound, his face calm. The rope was rough, frayed from use. The hangman placed it around his neck, pulled the hood down and stepped aside. When the cart rolled forward, his body dropped. The crowd erupted, some cheering, others crossing themselves. It should have been over in a minute, but Smith's body didn't hang still. He kicked, twisted, struggled. His feet scraped against the wood. The rope cut into his throat but didn't break his neck. He choked, clawed at the air, and then went limp. After 15 minutes, the hangman cut him down. A doctor checked for a pulse. There was none. The body was carted away, destined for burial. But fate, or something stranger, had other plans. Half an hour later, in the tavern where his corpse was being prepared, someone heard a sound. A groan, then another. The color was returning to his face. The body on the table, the dead man, began to breathe. John Smith was alive. The hangman's knot had slipped, tightening just enough to choke him unconscious, but not enough to kill him. And by the time he woke, London was already whispering. They called him Half-Hang Smith, the man who had outlasted death. He spent weeks recovering, coughing up blood, speaking through a rasp that never went away. When he stood trial again, the judge stared at him like he'd seen a ghost, and in a rare moment of mercy, or superstition, granted him a full pardon. He has already suffered the punishment of death, the judge said. John Smith walked free. For the rest of his life, he carried the mark of the rope across his neck, a pale, permanent ring that told every stranger what he'd survived. He returned to work as a carpenter, tried to stay out of trouble, and lived another 15 years. And yet, those who met him swore there was something haunted in his eyes, as if he'd seen what waited beyond the noose, and come back knowing it would never really let him go. But not every man who survived the gallows found peace. In America, more than 3 centuries later, another condemned man would face the same fate and wake beneath the lights of an execution chamber that refused to finish the job. Doyle Lee Hamm, Alabama, February 22, 2018. A concrete room lined with steel, sterile and bright enough to erase the idea of mercy. The man on the table was Doyle Lee Hamm, 61 years old, bald, frail, veins collapsed from years of cancer treatments and addiction. He had been on death row for 3 decades, and the state had decided it was finally time to end the wait. His crime went back to 1987, a robbery turned murder in the small town of Cullman. He'd broken into a motel with a gun looking for cash. The night clerk, Patrick Cunningham, a college student trying to make rent, handed over the money without a fight. But Doyle shot him anyway. One life ended in seconds. Another was condemned to the slowest execution imaginable. For 30 years, appeals and retrials circled like vultures. Then, in 2018, the state cleared the final hurdle. They scheduled his death by lethal injection. But by then, Doyle was a shell of the man who'd pulled that trigger. He had terminal lymphoma, tumors in his lymph nodes and legs. Doctors warned that his veins were so damaged they might not hold a needle. Alabama didn't listen. They strapped him down, wrists, ankles, chest. He lay staring at the fluorescent lights, a cross between resignation and disbelief in his eyes. The team began to work. Left arm, right arm, leg, foot. Each attempt ended the same way: failure. The needle struck, met resistance, and withdrew bloodied. Minutes stretched into an hour. The room filled with mutters, the shuffle of feet, the sterile smell of alcohol wipes. Witnesses could see the technicians whispering, heads down, trying to hide the tremor in their hands. They turned him on his side, prodded his groin, searching for a vein they could reach. He groaned, gasped, flinched. A nurse apologized under her breath. After 2.5 hours, the warden gave the order. Stop. The execution was called off. Doyle Lee Hamm was left covered in puncture wounds, bruises spreading under the skin, veins shredded by the effort to kill him. He was wheeled back to his cell, alive but broken, his body now carrying the evidence of the state's failure more clearly than any court record ever could. His lawyers later called it torture under medical lighting. The state called it a complication. They never tried again. The cancer finished what they couldn't. He died in 2021, still on death row, the sentence technically incomplete. To the prison, it was an inconvenience. To the world, a headline that vanished in a day. But to anyone paying attention, Doyle Lee Hamm was one more name on the growing list of people the system had already killed, just not efficiently enough to call it justice. And long before Doyle's name was written in ink and pain, another man had stood on the same kind of stage, declared dead, laid out for dissection, and opened his eyes before the scalpel fell. William Duel, England, 1740. London winter, the kind of cold that clings to skin, to iron, to breath. In a city obsessed with punishment, death was not just justice, it was spectacle. William Duel was 17, poor, uneducated, a servant with nothing to his name but bad luck and worse company. He'd been convicted of rape and murder alongside several others. The victim, Sarah Griffin, a servant girl no older than himself. A fight, an assault, a body left behind. The others fled. Duel was caught. The verdict came swiftly. Hanged by the neck until dead. On November 24th, 1740, a crowd gathered at Tyburn. They came early. Bakers, dock workers, housewives, all pressed shoulder to shoulder to watch a boy die. The hangman did his work with routine precision. The hood went on. The rope dropped. The body fell. It twitched once, then hung still. The cart moved on, the crowd dispersed, and the city returned to its business of living. William Duel's corpse was cut down and delivered to the Company of Surgeons, a customary donation of death. In those days, the bodies of executed criminals were handed to medical schools for dissection. The idea was that even in death, a criminal could serve the public good. They laid him on the table, pale and still, beneath the flicker of candlelight. A crowd of young surgeons gathered, scalpels ready. The air smelled of wax, smoke, and cold flesh. Then someone saw it, a tremor in his chest, a flutter at his throat. At first they thought it was imagination, nerves twitching, a reflex. But then his chest rose again, and again. The boy was breathing. Panic spread through the room. The surgeons stepped back. One shouted for help, another crossed himself. A man who had been hanged, declared dead, and delivered for dissection was alive. They worked to revive him. Water, blankets, prayer. Within minutes, William Duel opened his eyes. He couldn't speak. He barely moved. But he was unmistakably alive. The surgeons called the authorities, uncertain what to do with a man legally executed but physically breathing. And in an age when superstition and law often shared the same bed, the king's mercy arrived. His death sentence was commuted to transportation for life. They shipped him to the colonies, a ghost among the living. No one knows what became of him after that voyage. Some say he died at sea. Others claim he worked as a laborer, lived quietly, never again spoke of the rope or the blade. But his name, William Duel, whispered through anatomy halls and execution records as the boy who died, and then didn't. Because even in an age when death was a public performance, sometimes the curtain rose again. Machines, ropes, bullets, stones, all built to deliver finality, all proven imperfect.